Good evening, and welcome to another broadcast of Quantum Experience. Before we begin with my guest tonight, I would like to invite you to visit my website, awakener.com, AWAKENER.com. Lots of good articles, and especially what 2014 has in store for you. So if you're curious, look it up, read it. If you have any questions, send me an email to michael@awakener.com. That's michael@awakener.com. My guest this evening is Merle Temple, a former narcotics officer and author. Mr. Temple is a native of Tupelo, Mississippi. He received a BPA and a Master's of Criminal Justice at Ole Miss University and a graduate of the DEA Academy in Washington, D.C. He was the first captain of the Mississippi Bureau of Narcotics in the 1970s. Held hostage while working undercover, he later met men hired by organized crime to kill him in a standoff near Memphis, Tennessee, and was involved in a gun battle with drug dealers in a heroin deal gone sour. He was an internal affairs investigator of a plan to corrupt the Mississippi Bureau of Narcotics. His story is told in his book, A Ghostly Shade of Pale. His book contains all the diverse elements of a Southern Gothic novel nightmare that converge and occupy the same stage. History files on a bygone era are ripped open and rewritten in temporal games, with eternal consequences at the intersection between heaven and hell, between the visible and the invisible. You can visit with Merle at www.merletemple.com. That's MERLE Temple, TEMPLE, all one word, merletemple.com. And without further ado, let me bring on my guest, Mr. Merle Temple. Merle, good evening. How are you?
Hey, Michael. I'm doing well. Glad to be here.
Thank you very much. We had a brief conversation prior to tonight, and you told me a little bit about the book. I find it fascinating, and I guess it's kind of like a movie, and maybe one day it will be. Who knows? But give us the plot, if you can, and then talk to us about the whole process of A Ghostly Shade of Pale.
Well, Michael, we hope that it might be a movie one day. We're just back from Hollywood and signing books for the cast of Criminal Minds. So hope springs eternal, and we're waiting to hear on that. But that was quite a fairy tale experience. Ghostly Shade of Pale is written as fiction, but it's based on things that happened to me in the early 1970s when I left Ole Miss, young, naive, and didn't really know what I was getting into when I entered the first drug wars that had been declared by President Nixon at that time. And so I joined the Mississippi Bureau of Narcotics and went deep undercover. And so the book just kind of chronicles that. It's a different kind of book. It's not like a plot you've read 1,000 times before. It's a thinking person's book. It's written as literature. I did not want to write just another throwaway book in a throwaway world. And our reviews, which are really good, have pretty much reflected that. And people have kind of adopted this book, and it chronicles the triumphs and the failures of Michael Parker, the young agent who is based on modeled after me, and a lot of harrowing experiences he gets into. And like you said, he was held hostage undercover, almost killed, and later lured out by hitmen hired by organized crime just south of Memphis to kill him. And then there was a terrible gun battle where they're ambushed, and all of that, really happened to me. And so it's been received real well. It's out in Hollywood, Michael. They when they interviewed me in Beverly Hills, they said, "What is it about Mississippi and Mississippi writers? All the writers that come out of Mississippi." They said, "Is it something in the water?" And I said, part of it, I think, is our oral tradition we have here of storytelling and passing down stories from generation to generation. And anyway, it's just a thrill for me to write my first book, which is first in a trilogy. I'm writing the sequel now called A Rented World, so just a thrill to write your first book and just to have it received so warmly.
So this trilogy that you're writing, book 1 is the one we're going to talk about tonight, and then books 2 and 3 that are in the future are a continuation of this story. And
that's correct.
Right?
Everyone who's read Ghostly pretty much is demanding the sequel, and which is a good thing. And tell them that, well, I am writing on the sequel, but I have to also market and promote the first book, so to set up the books to come, and so far that's going pretty well. I've learned a lot about this treacherous book business, and from trial and error many times, but we're getting more and more good reviews and appearing on programs like yours, which are very helpful.
Oh, excellent. So tell us a little bit about the plot. Where does it start, and how did you get involved in the beginning, drawn into this? Because it's not really an autobiographical novel. It's you removed as a third person writing about your experiences. So maybe you can tell us some of the experiences that you had that are in the book.
Well, like I said, it begins actually. It begins in chapter 1 with a pretty gripping scene that kind of sets up the rest of the book, dealing with a lawyer who's in partnership with organized crime and pretty much sold his soul, for the things of the world, and he pays a terrible price for doing that, and I won't spoil it, but it's pretty gripping and grab you by the throat type of opening, I think. And then it flashes back and it picks up young Michael Parker, who is raised in a rural community in the Old South, just south of Tupelo, Mississippi, and it kind of shows the relationship he has with his grandmother, who lives with him, Pearl. And the readers really, really liked that relationship, and that was very personal to me because I used Pearl's real name. Pearl was my grandmother, who lived with me and was my buddy and my confidant, and passed down many, many stories to me from previous generations, and it kind of helped along my love of storytelling. And so it kind of begins there and lays that foundation and follows young Michael when he graduates from high school and goes to Washington, D.C., where he goes a week after high school, rides a train up there seeking adventure, and he goes to work for the FBI as a fingerprint technician, winds up meeting J. Edgar Hoover, and which all of that I did, and which was unusual because people had worked there 25 years had never seen Hoover, but he came to a church I attended just east of the Capitol building, and it was built on the site where he was born, and so he came there for a dedication of a large window and so forth, and so just a lot of ventures for a young, very naive and unsophisticated 18-year-old kid from Mississippi, and then the book follows Michael as he returns home, goes to Ole Miss. And then, just as he's graduating, he's looking around trying to decide, where he is going to work, because he's always loved law enforcement and seen himself in that role. And so President Nixon had just consolidated a lot of agencies in Washington and actually consolidated a lot of power, which in some respects we may still be paying for today. But that's another story. But he, so the Mississippi Bureau of Narcotics is modeled after the new DEA, the Drug Enforcement Administration. And so Michael signs on with them in the early days when there are very few agents and a lot of solo undercover work and no cavalry coming to the rescue if you get in trouble. And really just the guys were just flying by the seat of their pants and kind of making it up as they went, because it was all so new, and so just at many of my book signings, I've been reunited with some of the agents who survived all that, and we talk about those days and how young and wet behind the ears we were, and it was a miracle that we did survive.
If you knew now what you knew then, would you have done the same thing again?
Well, I think so. You just you play the hand that's dealt you, and I think I was pretty much meant to travel that path that I chose, and for as long as I stayed there, and there were some people who didn't make it through those days. One of my men was tragically shot and killed at 25, and there were some pretty tough things that we had to deal with, and some just there were a few who succumbed to alcoholism or drug use themselves, and there was just so much pressure and so many long hours worked, and you took a bunch of kids, really young guys who, for the most part, there were a few female agents, but you took those young folks and who were raised up in the 50s and 60s in conservative America, and you put them out in the midst of some pretty wild times where there was just a buffet of forbidden pleasures, you might say, laid in front of them, and
no rules. There were no rules.
That's right. And there were some who just succumbed to the temptation, but so many who maybe stepped off the right path for a while and are now back on the path that I've been reunited with too. So blessed to get to see them and to relive those days and to renew those relationships.
Now, that's another question I have. When you go undercover, you really have to lose yourself, who you were. It's like walking through a door, closing it on your life, and you go into this other world. And being in this world, in order to be good undercover, which I've never been, so I'm only asking, you may have to give up your values and belief systems and do things you necessarily might not do, whether it's take drugs or alcohol or be involved in other activities that you normally wouldn't do. What happens to you personally? How hard is it to maintain your center in this kind of a situation? As you said, some of the people gave in and went over to that side, but then they came back.
Yeah, it was always a challenge. It really was, and I don't think that was something that they really factored in. And when they hired all of us right out of college, which I commend them for, because at that time in Mississippi, particularly, I would think the hiring at the state level of law enforcement was pretty much done by political patronage or nepotism. And so I commend the director of the Bureau, Kenneth Fairley, at that time, who was our founder. And he wanted something better, and so he hired all of the young new centurions as the college graduates in criminal justice were labeled in those days, and kind of a takeoff on Joseph Wambaugh's book out at that time. And so we were thrust out there, and but you did have to get really deep into the character you were presenting yourself to be, and you had to be ready with your little programs of comebacks if you were challenged and accused of being the man, and so on, and but it was always vital. I think you could never lose sight of who you really were. But there were times, I would come in from the road and I would just kind of stop and look at myself in the mirror, and just say, "Who are you? Are you him or are you him?" And as far as succumbing to those things, it wasn't necessary to do evil things. When you were working undercover, you always had that line that you knew you couldn't cross, and some did cross that line, and they would pay for it, or it would come back to haunt them in court when they were testifying. When you could always count on a defense lawyer, they're out to get their client off, and they would anyway. But they would, if they had any information that you were maybe having personal relations with someone undercover, or that you were using drugs, you could be certain that you would hear about that when you were being cross-examined. And so, there was that line, and you just couldn't cross it.
But if you didn't do those things, then your cover gets blown. I mean, whether it's smoking marijuana or snorting cocaine or other drugs, if you're undercover and you can't do those things, how are you able to do your job without them finding out that you're one of the good guys?
Well, most of the time, so we were not hanging out with people who were just casual users of drugs. I mean, we were trying to get at the dealers, and so we were kind of moving in and out of situations. And I personally always represented myself, to be someone who was looking to buy drugs, and hopefully a large quantity of drugs from a major dealer, and if we could, and we eventually did work our way up to some major dealers. At first, it was kind of it was just you took what you got, and that's how you began. But we were just moving in and out of those situations. We didn't live with those people for the most part. And if you really exposed yourself and you chose to go in and just live amongst them and go to their parties all the time, representing yourself just as being just another user, then you were really setting yourself up for a long, hard fall.
Right. So there's good guys and there's bad guys, but some of the good guys were actually bad guys. Can you talk about that in the book?
Yeah, the book is I guess you'd say, very introspective in one sense, and there's some things laid out there. I try not to telegraph everything. I have a respect for my readers, and I let them draw from things as they happen, and they're retold or either fictionalized for the flow of the story, and let them draw their own conclusions and see what they think about each situation. But it was something that was very fluid, and you had to be prepared at all times to step up toe to toe with somebody or nose to nose, and if they accused you of being an agent or whatever, and have a good comeback. And it was not only vital to the case and the undercover operations you were working, it was many times it was critical to you staying alive.
Right. Well, you mentioned, for example, in Mississippi, a lot of the police officials at the upper echelons were appointed by politicians. Politicians always have their hands in as many pies as they can stick them in order to get as much money as they can to get reelected. That may sound a little cynical, but I think it's fairly accurate. So how were you able to trust upper echelon police officials with your life when you weren't sure whether or not they were good guys or bad guys?
Well, the book deals with that quite a bit. Basically, we survived by the famous line from the X-Files where the informant tells Agent Mulder, he said, "Trust no one, Mr. Mulder. Trust no one." And that was basically our motto. And you learned right away really to trust no one, because there was just so much money, drug money, in those days floating around that compromised government at all levels. And so the book deals with that, and we had to learn early on that just because somebody had a badge on did not make them our friend. Matter of fact, they may have been our worst enemy. And because before the Bureau of Narcotics was formed in Mississippi, there really was no state agency that local officials, law enforcement, or whatever really had to fear, because most other state law enforcement agencies would always check in with local officials before they did anything, and that was a prescription for a disaster, and not to mention being terribly ineffective. So there were some tense things there, and you'll see that in a book in a very dramatic fashion in one gun battle that takes place, how Chief of Detectives really was working to compromise us, and so it was a constant thing that we had to deal with.
Can you, back in the 70s, 60s and 70s, when drug use began to explode in this particular country, I can't speak for the rest of the world, as these drugs were coming in, were they being pushed by what we would call the standard mafia, or were there groups from outside the country that were dealing directly in Mississippi and trying to sell these things?
Well, it was a mix. You did have the traditional mafia families that would have their fingers in all pies, and then you had the loose confederation of organized criminals known as the Dixie Mafia, who were maybe sometimes affiliated with the mafia crime families and or did business with them, but they certainly weren't inside, and they weren't made men or anything like that. But they were ruthless and pretty effective in a lot of things. And in the old days, there might have been the big auto theft rings and bootlegging and the numbers games, and that kind of thing. And then when drugs came along, there was just so much money there that they began to do it, and they would go down, they would leave here and go into either into Central America, down in what was then Honduras, or either they'd go down through McAllen, Texas, and enter down into Mexico, which was a big port of entry back in those days. And this was a little bit, my time was a little bit prior to the emergence of the cartels in Colombia and Escobar and all of that. That came a little bit later. But this was kind of the precursor. This was the early days. And and then you had freelancers, too, that were, we have so many airfields in Mississippi, the little small crop duster airfields. And these pilots who had small planes were flying out of those airfields under radar and going to whatever their source of choice was and loading up their plane with as much marijuana, cocaine, or whatever that the plane would bear, and then flying back and setting up their own distribution rings. And some of those were pretty formidable distributors of illegal drugs. And also, the other thing you see in Ghost Leak is a telling of what some people don't know, and they were not the only ones using those airfields. Also, our intelligence agencies at the federal level, some of them were using those airfields to hire mercenary pilots, and they would hop out of those small airfields loaded with guns to go into Central America to support, whatever side, we were supporting at that time. And when they came back loaded with drugs. And the only question we had, was it sanctioned or was it unsanctioned? And at times we believed that it was sanctioned.
That they were allowed to bring drugs back for sale or for personal use, or both? No.
They came back loaded with amounts of drugs. It was certainly not personal use. What they brought back, one person could, if they lived, they could use them for the rest of their lives. This was definitely, for sale. And some of these pilots were quite proficient. One once bragged that he could land his plane at night in the dark in a cornfield with the corn standing and not lose one brick of hashish or marijuana or whatever.
Wow. So, it's a lot to get a hand around. Let me ask you kind of an off-the-wall question here. With your background in law enforcement, would organized crime, with all these billions of dollars that are being made, would that go away if these drugs were legalized? I know it's a simplistic question.
Well, I do think this. That we learned pretty early on that trying to stop drug trafficking, as long as there was this huge demand for it and this huge money in it, it was like trying to dam up the Mississippi River with a shovel. It just was impossible, and it was kind of a holy grail to us for a while, and we would always think, well, we're getting better, if we only can take out, this organization or that organization, then things will be good. But of course, for every one we took out, there were 3 or 4 or 5 to take their place because the money is just too much. And so, I think there's probably a feeling that we, now we've spent over $1 trillion in the drug wars, and sentences have been doubled and tripled and quadrupled, and locking up so many people, some of whom probably don't deserve that, and the American people are not served by locking up all these people and for such long draconian sentences, and because they sometimes prosecute them as drug kingpins, and when they're really just very low-level people. And but you have this. There's so much collateral damage to the criminal justice system when you back off and look at this objectively and see how there've been abuses all around. By prosecutors, by judges, by the courts, by law enforcement, and other players. It's a big business, and so I think there has to be some fine tuning of it, and that's not to say that I'm soft on drug dealing or anything. I'm certainly not, because I've lived it and almost paid the price for it, and some of the people I know who did pay a heavy price for it and are not with us anymore. But it's an emotional thing too. But you just have to step back and say, we have a finite amount of resources. How do we use those resources in the best way with the most minimal damage to civil liberties? Because we still believed in those days very much in the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. And I've seen an erosion of that by some law enforcement agencies, and that's very troubling.
So would legalization help or not really make any difference? And I know we can't legalize heroin. Maybe we can. I'm not really up to date on what people are proposing, but marijuana, cocaine, you can't legalize. But
well, I've seen some countries that I've been looking at and watching, and they decriminalize some things. And, the knee-jerk critics on the other side would say there were going to be all these terrible results for that, and that just wasn't the case. They predicted violent crime would go up as associated with it, and there would be this and this horror that would come from it. And, I just, the facts and the figures just don't bear that out. But there's always, on all sides, whether you're for or against or whatever, it's always best to step back from all the emotion, and that's how you make good decisions, because there are vested interests all around that are profiting in one way or another from this whole apparatus that has been in place now for quite a while. And so you just have to step back and look at it and say, how do we do that? And especially in the United States, when we're drowning in 17, 18 trillion dollars of debt, and they're just only so long that you can print money, and beyond that, it's always
it's worthless.
I always remember what Ben Franklin said, that he who would trade liberty for so-called security may soon find he has neither. And that really concerns me, because that's the trends I see now. And
that's really an interesting point. It came with the Patriot Act as well. People want security, but what they don't realize is to get that security, they're going to have to give up their rights. in some instances. I remember when they were thinking about getting rid of the habeas corpus, that if my neighbor called the police and said, I don't know, there's people going in and out of Michael's house all hours of the night, or all afternoon, whatever it was, or he's got people that look like they're Arabs coming in his house, I could be arrested and held indefinitely if they took away my habeas corpus. But on the other hand, I have all this security, but no personal rights. I don't think that was eventually put into the Patriot Bill, but it was something they were discussing. And so you're right. Without taking personal responsibility for your actions, you'll never have security because you can't count on somebody else to do it for you.
Well, that's true, and I think some people don't think it through sometimes. They say, well, I'm not, I hear this refrain sometimes, well, I'm not doing anything wrong, so I don't care, but you may not think you care, but you will be made to care eventually if you study history. And the more you empower any central government, the more in jeopardy, freedom and liberty are. And, the federal agencies ask for the right for a federal agent to just arrest someone, with no probable cause and no warrant, just if they were a terrorist. That's how they sold it. Everybody's a terrorist today in the minds of some people.
Unless proven otherwise, right.
So. Yeah, that's their pitch. And so they now have the authority. If they ask you, an agent asks you, is it the sun shining? And you say, well, I don't think it is. And he said, I think you lied to me. And if he deems that you lied to him at his or her sole discretion, then you're arrested with no probable cause, and you can be locked up and held for a long, long time. And they pitch these things for terrorism. But my experience is when they get that power, what they do is they turn it on you and me, on the average American citizen, and they already look at our bank accounts on money that we earn legally. And there's a threshold, and if you say that, if you exceed that amount of deposits or withdrawal within a week, because the banks have to report, all over $10,000, and if you're, say, making your payroll and you exceed that, they report you. But where they get you is, say, if you're making your payroll and you do 7,000 this week and 8,000 the next week and 7,000 the next week, they'll indict you for a thing called structuring your withdrawals to evade the $10,000 threshold. And with no probable cause, no evidence that was illegal money or anything, they can just come and indict you, and they do. And they got that power again by saying we need it to deal with organized crime, drug trafficking, and terrorism. And so we just have to be mindful of these things, when you see liberty eroding all around you.
That's pretty scary.
Well, it should be.
That's pretty scary. So what we have going on today, just a little bit away from the book for a moment, states are voting to legalize the use of marijuana. And I think not because the humanitarian, but because of the tax money they can make off of this. So it's not that we're being looked out for. It's the same as, let's open up a casino. We'll get a lot of money from that. Or let's open this up. We'll get a lot of money from that. The government sees this as a including local governments, as a business opportunity to raise more funds. And I would think if you could buy something legal, that would cut down on crime because you're not having to steal to get it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's the argument, of course, for one of the arguments for legalization of private use of the more benign drugs, if there are any. I mean, no drugs. There's a consequence of ingesting any kind of chemical into your body. But having said that, the only question is, because there is that, And rather than saying, well, there's such a thing as personal responsibility, do you then turn to the nanny state and say, okay, we'll trade away all of this if you go out and just arrest everybody you see, and we don't care how you do it. And so I think that's a losing situation.
Until your name comes up on the list. I mean, it would be the same. Again, just a little digression. We have the alcohol industry, and alcohol kills a lot more people, I think, than drugs. I haven't done the research, but it's an assumption that alcohol kills more people, causes more auto accidents, and yet that's never regulated because the amount of money that goes into the politicians' coffers. The same thing with what the world's wrestling with now would be these genetically manufactured seeds. Many people in Europe don't want it. Here in the United States it is, because the people in control put the money into the coffers of the politicians. So here again, we're talking money talks. And the welfare of the general person, whether it's trying to outlaw drugs or bad food or alcohol, whatever it is, the average person really has very little say in it unless they can make an intelligent decision and put people into office who will support them. But the moment that person's in office, they got to start raising more money in order to be reelected again. So it's almost a no-win situation for us.
Well, it is, and Lord Acton, what he said was as true a statement as you'll ever hear. That power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely.
Right.
And so, if you just give carte blanche authority to people, you're just beginning to play Russian roulette, with your freedom and your liberties and your lives. And so, I don't want anyone to tune in late to this and think that I've suddenly gone soft on enforcement, because I haven't. But I also recognize at the same time, that there are really serious concerns and threats to liberty, all done in the name of keeping us safe. And when somebody comes out and says, trust me, I want to keep you safe, but I'm going to have to take this and that, then, you better back up and, and guard yourself. Because there's just so much manipulation going on by very clever and crafty people who play on emotions, from all sides. And so it takes some sober thinking and people who understand, how the world really works and how many users and abusers of the public that now exist.
There doesn't seem to be a great deal of support for law enforcement. Everybody thinks that they're after them, so to speak, and yet they want security. How do we deal with this? We can't make people more responsible unless people become more intelligent, and people don't want to be intelligent because that's going to make them different from their friends, and their friends won't like them, and so they just stay where they're at and let the status quo continue. It's really a difficult situation.
Well, it is, and I tell you, the difference is between our days in the 70s and the men and women that I work with, that I try to pay homage to in the book for the good people that they were, and some of them still are, is there's been this steady kind of militarization of law enforcement, which was always, anathema to people who love liberty and to the founders. And you see, all the SWAT teams that have come to be, that are mobilized for things that any good police officer, could have handled in our day and could still handle. And you see, in some of the federal agencies, you see this movement back and forth between active military and law enforcement. And so they go from a battlefield situation sometimes into domestic enforcement. In the battlefield, the Bill of Rights is not around, and it's a life and death situation. And when you move back and forth between those worlds, I think that's a very dangerous situation, because you get that ends justifies the means attitude that kind of sometimes maybe it comes with you, and it shouldn't be ever in domestic law enforcement. And I spoke to some agents the other day, and who love this book, and they said they wish it was still like this today, and because most of their time is spent now working wiretaps. And I told them we did not have wiretap authority, and I'm glad that we didn't have wiretap authority, because there's just so much potential for abuse there, and our work was all painstaking, investigative work.
In the write-up, and they have one here at Amazon.com, people can go to Amazon and read the first chapter, I believe, as well as get some more information. And also on your website, merletemple.com, MERLETEMPLE, merletemple.com. There's a lot of information, where you're going to be, a little bit about your biography. And while I was going over this, one of the things that I saw was somebody that was very close to you came to harm. Can you talk to us about that?
Well, in the book, there are different situations. As I mentioned before, there was an agent who was killed, and one relationship in the book that Michael has is with a young woman that he is seeing and has had a long history with, and that is the kind of hidden romance in the book, which so many readers, particularly our female readers, like, and we do. By the way, it's interesting, and because this is a gripping book, a gripping story that scares you when you read it in many places. But they really like that hidden romance behind all of that, and gives it another dimension, I think, to the story. And so you'll see how that relationship evolves, with Michael and this young lady, and the dangers that come from that. And I would say, while I'm thinking about it, that we just come out with our second edition, the softback, nice softback. It's at Amazon, and the ebook is there also. And I still have some of the pretty hardback first editions that everybody likes to get signed and collect and keep in case a book or the author ever become famous. A lady came through one of my signings, and she had sold back one of her books that John Grisham had signed for her grandson. Needed a car, and she knew where he was signing, and Grisham buys those books back now, the first editions that are signed, for Christmas gifts to his friends, and I think he gave her $2,500 for that book.
Wow.
And she probably could have gotten more for it on eBay too, but she needed it. And so if you need any of those, you can go through my website, merletemple.com, MERLETEMPLE.com. And I still have some of those, and we could mail those if you're a collector of those books. But they're, I would say 75% of this book is probably based on things that really happened. There are some composite characters, and there's some fiction. But all in all, I think it's the story generally based on truth. It resonates with many of our readers, and in this part of the world, I get calls all the time from people, one including from our congressman, that they think they know who this character really was, or that character really was, and oftentimes they are correct. And
so interesting that they would know who the fictional people are.
Yeah, well, it's in a rural area, a state like this, everybody knows everybody, and so, we get that quite a lot. And early on, when my publisher asked me, was anybody going to show up from the past and be angry about recognize themselves and want to come hurt us? And I said, well, most of the people who would object, if they did, are probably no longer with us, either by natural or unnatural causes in many cases.
Wow. So, and those people that were in the book, how many of them are still in power? Or, well, I guess by now they may have died.
Not many still in power anymore. Many have just passed away, as I said, from one cause or another, and Yeah, but some of the agents are still around, and like I said, come to our book signings, and I'm able sometimes to tell them things that I couldn't tell them all those 35 plus years ago about why I asked them to do this or that, and it's been some really tearful and emotional reunions, that have taken place when we sit down and talk about, well, when this happened and we were almost killed, this was the reason, and of course, in the end, Michael heads up a big internal affairs investigation, as I did, and there was people in high levels of government that wanted to corrupt the agency, to clip the wings of the State Bureau of Narcotics and bring them to heel, because we were just arresting too many people who had been protected, and suddenly, we had upset the so-called natural order of things. And I will tell you a truism that anytime you rock the boat and you upset what has been the established order, you better strap on your armor, because I said they will come for you and to destroy you in one means or another, either to take your life or take your reputation or your liberty, and to steal everything that you worked all your life to gain.
Well, now, doesn't seem fair, but that's the way the thing is. That's the way it is, isn't it? Those with power want to keep it.
Well, they do, and there was a price that I had to pay for heading up that investigation, just as Michael does. And in book 2, people ask me, well, what will happen to Michael? What will he find out next time? And I said, well, he'll find out in new ways that the drug criminals and organized crime folks he dealt with were really nothing compared to the political criminals that he would encounter when he went into the corporate world and into high-level political campaigns. And so that's all this is to set up, again, what comes in book 2. And he'll also discover, too, in ways that he always knew at one level, but he discovers at even another level, that between there's this unholy relationship between organized crime and politics and sometimes the corporate world.
Wow. It's like antimatter versus matter, and the antimatter are the bad guys, and when they meet the matter that we live in this third dimension, we get destroyed.
Well, it's like the one famous godfather, the most powerful godfather in the country, visited one of our high-level officials here in the state in a clandestine meeting at midnight one night, and his favorite saying was that 3 people can keep a secret if 2 are dead.
I shouldn't be laughing, but it's an interesting statement and probably very true. Because the other 2 can have pressure, whether it's from family or finances or the law. And then I guess all of us want to make ourselves number one, so regardless of what we promise, we want to get up and see tomorrow, so we give in.
Yeah, we do, and I'll tell you, there's a thread in this book, and it continues in the next 2, where Michael he's a seeker and a searcher, and he is seeking God, and he is saved in some very dramatic situations by divine intervention, and so that's another thread in the book too. And as he tries to find out, he seeks what he calls. He doesn't settle for the simplicity that most do on this side of complexity. What he is seeking is the true simplicity on the far side of complexity, which takes a lot of effort, a lot of courage, and a lot of work to break through that barrier and discover what it is that he's been seeking all along.
Does it ever feel futile sometimes? That no matter how much you do, the water, no matter how many sandbags you put up or seawalls, the water's still going to come in? Oh,
sure, yeah. And if you focus on that, you'll just go away and give up.
So,
And
so I agree with that. So we go back to what drove you into wanting to make the world a better place, wanting eventually becoming a law enforcement officer, which you explained at the very beginning of the interview. But you're working with other groups now, helping people. You're working with prison populations, among other things. How are you? How are you working with them? What is the message you're getting to them? Sharing with them.
well, I think I'm a Christian, and I believe that any person can be redeemed by faith in Jesus Christ, and that's what we present to them. There are so many stories from people who are incarcerated. And really, the majority of people is sitting in prison now. Not all of them, of course, but there's some of them very dangerous. But we've lost sight of prisons really should be reserved for those people really who scare us, especially for long prison terms. And, we shouldn't give up on those people. If you do, it's self-defeating. There's going to be high recidivism rates. And the people do come back who have not been approached and shown that there is a better way. And they come back at like a 67, 68% recidivism rate. But generally, the ones who are reached by people with prison ministries only recidivate at like a 10 to 15% rate. And so, that's what we do and try to tell them, to help them understand, who never mattered and who always will, and that there are second chances in life, and I certainly have been granted many second chances myself, and I tell everybody on this book tour, I'll be given a chance 35, 40 years later to see people and to say one of two things, either thank you or I'm sorry. And they never remember what you're thanking them for or what you're apologizing for. And I tell them that doesn't matter because I do. And so it's been a blessing to do that and to sit down and talk with people. Some people who we don't agree on very much, but to find that there is still a place for civil discourse and conversation, and rather than just what you see on TV and sometimes on radio nowadays too, just people screaming at each other. And the louder one, they don't have sometimes very good arguments. They just say, "Well, I'm louder than you are," and I just think that's self-defeating.
You're right. I would agree with that. And what the work you're doing in the prisons, and I really didn't finish the original train of thought of what got you into this, is basically wanting to make a difference. Not necessarily winning the war or even winning a battle, but making a difference. And if you can influence one person, then you're satisfied. Everything beyond one is a bonus.
Oh, sure. What greater thing would you ever do than to lead one person out of the darkness and turn their lives around? And some people have told us that have come to our book signings and said that there are some cases of people who just read this book who their lives were turned around when no one else could reach them, and those are humbling things to hear. And early on in my childhood, I was raised up in a different kind of America, and more simplistic, I guess, in many ways. And I learned some really hard lessons about how life really is at times. But all of my heroes were the clear guys with the white hats and who always did the right thing. And so that's what inspired me early on to go out and get engaged. And then, you have to adjust as you go forward and look at things that that will matter and the things that will be eternal.
Yeah, well, I kind of live my life like that, but it's really hard for a lot of people, I think, because they don't have a grounding, and they get lost, and they want to make money because so many people think that money gives security, or the acquisition of material things gives security, or the more power I have, the more secure I am. And yet, in the world that you move in, the more power you have. In actuality, I would think the less secure one is, because everybody wants to remove you and take your spot.
Oh, absolutely. This is all fleeting, the lives we live, and it's so temporary here in the temporal world, and it's a sad thing to live your life for nothing but the material and for power, and when you have no true friends and have many enemies, as you say, who are looking at every opportunity to undermine you, to hurt you, to ruin you, or to kill you. And so I've seen all of that so many times in law enforcement and later in politics in the corporate world, and you really learn as you grow older, what's really important in life.
Peace within yourself and peace in the world, and hopefully get people to realize that anything you do can be done back to you. So let's all follow that golden rule. And
absolutely. I have no fear anymore. God took all that from me. Because as Vince Gill sings in his song, what are they going to do to me? Threaten me with heaven?
Right. The name of the book is A Ghostly Shade of Pale. And when we were talking earlier, you said when you started writing, they were playing a whiter shade of pale in the background.
Yeah, well, early on, I love music. I have a jukebox in my mind, we call it. It's constantly playing something. I just listen now and then to see what's playing, and there's probably a million song lyrics in my head, and some days I say I can't remember my name almost, but I can sing all the lyrics to a song I hadn't heard in 40 and 50 years. But I use that effectively for backdrop, for flavor, and of the times that I write about. And somebody asked me one time, well, why do you insist on having it all in there? And I tell them, and again, it adds flavor and people remember. And I said, plus, if the producers pick it up, we got a ready-made soundtrack already laid down. And Whiter Shade of Pale was one of those classic songs that I always liked. And so I kind of grew that to become A Ghostly Shade of Pale, because the villain, the main villain in the book, is not only, he doesn't only suffer from psychosis, he also suffers from albinism. So he is truly a ghostly shade of pale and truly an evil person. And so I never wavered when I came up with that title. Through all that time when I was writing and setting it aside and coming back, one thing I never changed was that title, and people just love it.
Okay. Merle, thank you so much for being on the show today. Really appreciate it. The name of the book again, A Ghostly Shade of Pale, by Merle Temple, Merle. You can go to Amazon and read a little bit about it. Thank you all for listening tonight. Tune in next week for another edition of Quantum Experience.